What if the medieval era never ended? What if kings and knights still ruled the modern world? What if 21st century New York looked more like this? Welcome to my channel, and today we're going to find out what would happen if the Middle Ages lasted forever. The first thing you might notice about this alternate version of New York is that there aren't any cars. And this is one of the biggest differences between medieval and modern life. In the Middle Ages, travel was done by foot, horse, or boat. There were no cars, planes, or trains. If you wanted to get somewhere, you had to put one foot in front of the other. This meant that towns and cities were much smaller because it took so long to get anywhere. But trade still needed to happen, and merchants couldn't carry all of their wares on their back. So pack animals like oxen, horses, and donkeys were used to transport goods. These animals were strong but slow, and travel time was a major factor for trade. The fact that these animals needed to eat and drink along the way meant that travelers had to plan ahead. Travelers usually only set out during daylight hours, and they would stop at the next village or town once it started to get dark. This made roads busy during the day, but you could usually count on them being relatively safe after sunset. Because everyone was asleep, the roads were empty and therefore much safer for nighttime travelers. A castle, however, was a different story. While a castle might have been defensible, that doesn't mean it was pleasant to stay in. Many travelers would avoid staying in a castle if they could help it. That's not to say that inns and small shops didn't exist within the castle walls, but unlike in a regular city, you couldn't be sure that your goods would be safe inside a castle overnight. With the threat of bandits and enemy soldiers always present, people would have to guard their goods day and night. So unless you wanted to risk having your wagon raided, you'd have to spend the night in a castle. And while some castles were open to the public, many were private residences for the wealthy or powerful. Commoners would likely have had to crowd into a common room, which may not have even had a lock on the door. A traveler might have been able to leave his horse in the courtyard, but would have to keep watch over his donkey or pack animals throughout the night. Depending on where you were in the medieval world, you might even have to deal with unfriendly locals who weren't too happy that you were sharing their cramped living quarters. If you were lucky enough to make it through the Middle Ages and somehow end up in the modern era, you'd still probably prefer to stay in a hotel instead of a castle. It's unlikely that you'd ever set foot in a castle again, as they fell out of style during the 17th century, and the last castle to be built wasn't completed until 1648. Most castles today are nothing more than historical landmarks, though a few private residences still exist. They've gone out of style because of how expensive they are to maintain and update. For example, just imagine trying to install central air conditioning in a castle. Castles also don't conform to modern building codes, making them dangerous to live in. So unless you're very rich and don't mind spending most of your income on upkeep, it's best to stay in a hotel. Plus, you won't have to worry about pesky things like portcullises and moats getting in the way of your morning commute. Knights would have an even harder time adjusting to modern life. Being a knight was considered the highest honor in medieval society. To become a knight, you usually had to be born into a noble family. Once you reached adulthood, you would then swear loyalty to a king or queen and go through a special ceremony known as a knighting. After this ceremony, you would receive the rank of knight and would be expected to defend the king or queen in battle. Unlike medieval castles, becoming a knight didn't require any particular skills. Anyone who followed the right protocol could become a knight. However, you did need to prove yourself in battle to gain status as a warrior. Knights had many rules they had to follow, such as acting bravely and generously. They were also expected to show respect to those of higher rank and always tell the truth. Now, while it's always good to tell the truth, doing so could land you in hot water during the Middle Ages. Telling the truth to someone of lower social class than you was considered rude, and you could even get sued for slander if you told someone something bad about another person and that person could prove it wasn't true. So if your maid asked you how you liked her new dress, it would have been better to lie and say it looked lovely rather than risk being taken to court. Speaking of court, knights and nobles spent so much time traveling to and from court that there was a whole industry dedicated to keeping their horses fed. You could even become a horse herder if you managed to get a noble's attention. If a knight was traveling to court, he would need to bring several horses with him, as well as enough food and water to sustain both himself and his horses for the journey. This required quite an entourage, including servants to care for both the knight and his horses. Even when the knight wasn't traveling, he still needed someone to care for his mounts. So a job posting went out to see who was available to work as a horse herder. If you were the chosen applicant, you would then travel with the knight and his party to his destination. Then you would stay behind and care for the horses while the knight attended court proceedings. This meant that you got to stick close to a noble and see the inner workings of medieval government firsthand. Just try not to fall in love with the knight. History is full of tales of horse herders falling in love with the nobles they were employed to serve. And while a romance with a knight would have been exciting, it probably wouldn't have had a happy ending. While a horse herder's job was important, it was still considered menial labor, and she would never be accepted into the noble class, unless the knight decided to marry her, but he probably shouldn't, since marrying someone outside of his social class was also frowned upon. If you were a woman, you had very few options for employment. Women in the Middle Ages were expected to take care of the household while men worked outside the home. Men usually worked as farmers, laborers, or craftspeople, while women were expected to do housework and care for children. If you were a single woman, you could potentially work as a seamstress or a weaver. But these jobs paid very little, and you would still be expected to come home once you were married. While there were some female doctors and midwives, this was rare and they were often shunned by their peers. Women could own property and sometimes even run businesses, but they were never allowed to inherit land. If a woman died, her property would pass to her husband or male relatives. If a man died, his widow could continue to operate his business, but once she remarried, his estate would go to his heirs. Women were also allowed to become nuns, and many women entered convents to escape unwanted suitors. However, prostitution was rampant across Europe, and many women felt that becoming a nun was a better option than being forced into the sex trade. There is a lot of talk today about the gender pay gap and equal rights, but these issues were a huge problem in the Middle Ages too. Women were typically paid less than half of what men were paid for the same work, and if you were a woman who didn't feel like getting married, you were often judged harshly by society. There were even entire communities of women who lived together outside of society, known as the free spirit. These women chose to live outside of the constraints placed on women by medieval culture and were branded heretics by the church. Some historians believe that the church labeled them as witches and began persecuting them. So, if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, you definitely didn't want to be a horse herder. Medieval life was dangerous and unpredictable. Life expectancy was around 35 years old, so you might not even make it to the modern era to see how different things are now. Even if you did manage to survive the Middle Ages, you probably wouldn't enjoy life in a modern city. Cities today are much larger and more crowded than they were in the Middle Ages, and it can be difficult to navigate a city without a car. Not to mention that the pace of life is much faster and there is always something going on. It would take some time to adjust to modern life, but you could always find work as a jousting instructor or a blacksmith. And who knows, maybe you'll even get a chance to meet a real knight. They're not as common as they used to be, but they do exist. Now check out what would happen if Rome never fell, or watch what really killed the dinosaurs for another look at history. If you're interested in medieval history, politics, or society, this is for you. Kings, queens, dukes, duchesses, lords, ladies, knights, and peasants. If these terms mean nothing to you, don't worry. By the end of this episode, you will know exactly what they are and how they all fit together into the medieval world. So let's get started. Medieval Europe is often called a feudal society. That doesn't mean it was dirty, dark, and smelled bad. But it does mean that there was a certain system of government and land ownership that defined medieval life. It's not easy to describe this system in just a few minutes, but if you think of the chain of command in the military, it might help. In the military, there's the private, the corporal, the sergeant, the lieutenant, the captain, and so on until you reach the general. Each person has a rank and each person answers to someone higher than them. A private doesn't have to listen to a corporal, but he or she does have to listen to a sergeant, and the sergeant has to listen to the lieutenant, and so on. Feudalism was much the same. it was a hierarchy. In fact, we can start with the king. The king was at the top of the pyramid. He owned all of the land and everyone below him had. To answer to him, under the king were the lords. They were like the king's generals. Now, unlike the military, where most soldiers are grunts and only a very few are high-ranking officers, in feudalism, there were many more lords than there were kings. In England, for example, there were dozens of lords under King John. They were nobles, meaning that they had been given noble titles like lord or lady by the king. But they didn't own the land in their own right. Instead, the king allowed them to use the land for their lifetime. As soon as they died, the land went back to the king. Now the lords were expected to give something back to the king. First, they owed him military service. When the king went to war, his lords had to provide him with soldiers. Second, they also had to give him money, because even though the lord got to use the land, he or she wasn't allowed to sell it, and sometimes the king needed money and he took it from his lords. Finally, the lords had to swear loyalty oaths to the king, promising to be honest and obedient to him. In return for this, the king gave the lords special rights. For example, he might allow them to collect taxes from the people who lived on the land, or he might allow them to hold a court where they could judge minor crimes. Also, in most cases, if a lord died, his son would become the next lord and get to use that land. This meant that the land stayed in the family for generations, even though it never really belonged to them. Alright, so we've got the king and the lord. Who's next in line? Well, a lord who had a large amount of land might divide it up and give some of it to a lesser lord. That lord would then become a vassal of the original lord. Again, that word vassal comes from the military. Think about a corporal who is in charge of a small group of privates. Those privates are the vassals of the corporal. They do what he tells them to do. And in the same way, a lord's vassals had to do what he told them to do. They also had to give him soldiers for his army and money when he needed it. But in return, the lord had to protect his vassals and make sure they kept their land. And finally, we come to the last two parts of our feudal pyramid, the knight and the peasant. Remember, this is just a simplified version of feudalism, so things may seem a little bit too neat and orderly. In reality, there were many different levels of lords, vassals, knights, and peasants. For example, in France, a lord could be a duke or a count or a viscount or even a baron. There were lots of different ranks. Anyway, the knight was usually a young man of low noble birth. He wasn't born to be a knight, but he wanted to become one because being a knight was exciting and prestigious. In order to become a knight, he would serve as a page to a lord or lady and learn the skills needed to be a good fighter. He'd learn how to ride a horse, hunt, joust, and fight with weapons like swords and lances. When he was old enough, he'd probably go off to war with his lord and gain even more experience. But becoming a knight was difficult and dangerous. It required expensive armor and weapons. You could be killed or seriously injured at any time. So not every young man could become a knight, and it was certainly not a job that anyone could just do. Knights had to be brave, strong, and honorable. Okay, now we just need one more thing to complete our picture of the medieval world. We've got the king, the lord, the vassal, the knight, and then who owns the land? The peasants, of course. Peasants were the farmers who grew food for everyone else. While most Europeans during the Middle Ages were peasants, they weren't necessarily poor. They owned the animals and crops that they used to farm the land, but they couldn't move those animals and crops. That land belonged to the lord, and that's why the peasants were tied to the land. They couldn't go anywhere else. They also had to pay rent to the lord in the form of part of their crops, and they had to work for the lord directly sometimes, helping to build a house or repair a road. But in return, the lord was supposed to protect the peasants and make sure they had courts to deal with any problems they had. Let me say that again. The peasants had to work for the lord and give him some of their crops, but in return, the lord had to protect them and make sure they had courts to deal with any problems. Does that sound fair? It depends. During the High Middle Ages, feudalism worked pretty well in most cases. The king kept order throughout the kingdom. The lords kept order among the peasants on their land, and everyone knew what to expect from everyone else. But over time, feudalism began to fall apart. Kings became more powerful and lords less important. In many places, people began to buy and sell land instead of getting it through loyalty oaths. And finally, there was no longer enough land to go around. At first, the extra people lived alongside the peasants and became serfs. But later, as population increased, they moved into cities and became merchants and artisans. In other words, feudalism was the perfect system for a time when most people lived in the countryside and worked as farmers. But as trade grew and cities grew, feudalism fell out of favor. But what if it hadn't fallen out of favor? What if the USA today was still run by feudal lords? Imagine California as a duchy, New York as a kingdom, and Washington, D.C. as the emperor's seat. It sounds crazy, but in the Middle Ages, it was normal. Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, check out some others. They're just as fun. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, there was a battle between good and evil, light and dark, hot and cold. No, it wasn't an episode of The Simpsons. It was the Battle of Hoth from Star Wars. And we have to ask, could this battle have happened in real life? Now, obviously it didn't, because we don't have a bunch of sentient hairless apes walking around shooting lightning out of their hands. But what about the rest? Rebel X-Wings and TIE fighters? Sure, not likely we'll see those anytime soon, but Imperial at ST's snowspeeders, maybe even Wampus. If history has taught us anything, it's that weird stuff like this does happen eventually. So let's just hope it happens in our lifetime so we can see it. In the meantime though, we're gonna make do with what we got. So here are 5 ways the Battle of Hoth would go down if it were real. Number 3, medieval warfare, tanks, bows, arrows, catapults, knights. When you think of the Battle of Hoth, you think of big vehicles rolling around and firing at things. The rebel base is huge and well fortified. But they have got no way of stopping the Empire from rolling up outside and leveling them with artillery fire. This is where the medieval aspect comes in. For the sake of fun, let's assume medieval warfare tactics and weapons would work perfectly fine in the 21st century. So how would the Empire defend itself against catapults, longbows, and angry mobs of heavily armed infantry? Well, probably pretty well, actually. Medieval armies often had trouble sticking together, which might be a problem when facing off against the likes of an AT-AT. But if the medieval army brings its A game and takes advantage of natural terrain and some careful planning, they might just stand a chance. In fact, history is littered with examples of fewer, better-trained soldiers defeating larger, less organized ones. Against the tide of battle, a well-trained medieval force could certainly hold their own. And speaking of well-trained, number 2, training. Alright guys, listen up. We need a plan. The Rebel Alliance is sort of like Luke Skywalker, young and eager, but perhaps a little green. On the other hand, the Galactic Empire is much more like Darth Vader, powerful, experienced, and kind of scary. They also have a much bigger army. According to sources, somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 stormtroopers served in the Galactic Empire. By comparison, the entire Rebel Alliance only had around 6,000 troops on Hoth, but size isn't everything. Maybe the rebels could make up for their lack of numbers with superior training. We know from experience that soldiers with extensive training can defeat much larger forces. Think of the Spartans at Thermopylae or the Battle of Alesia. It's important to remember that military strategy is a lot like chess. Even with fewer pieces, a skilled player can often defeat a more novice one. The key to winning is strategy, skill, and experience. And luckily, the Empire had all 3. They were better equipped, had more experience fighting in large-scale conflicts, and had much better leadership. So despite the valiant efforts of Luke and his friends, it's likely the Empire would win a battle like this, especially considering their equipment. Number 1, equipment. Stormtrooper armor is pretty iconic, but it's also very practical. You wouldn't see many stormtroopers running around in their underwear after a heavy blast from Han Solo's blaster. Their armor is designed to protect them from small arms fire and the elements. Rebel armor, on the other hand, consists of a leather jacket and some knee pads. It looks cool and it works great for speeder bikes, but it won't offer much protection against blasters. The same goes for the Millennium Falcon and the AT-AT. We all know blasters are the real deal. There's no doubt that if Chewbacca had a rocket launcher, he would have gotten that memo before going toe-to-toe with an AT-AT. But what if he had something a bit more conventional? Say a World War II-era bazooka. Would that do the trick? It might, just barely. Although the AT-AT is much larger and heavily armored, it also moves rather slowly, and its main purpose is to support troops by providing covering fire. With enough rockets, Chewie could definitely take one of these things out. But who's gonna help him? Stormtroopers have repeating blasters with almost limitless ammo. Luke has a pistol with 6 shots. Han Solo has a bow and arrow. Luke might have some success with his lightsaber, though. Lightsabers are basically the perfect weapon. Not only do they look really cool, but they're made of pure energy, meaning they never dull and they're always sharp. Plus, you can deflect blaster bolts with them. Imagine trying to hit Leia with a blaster while she deflects your shots with her lightsaber. Impossible. The problem with lightsabers, though, is that they require a power source, and with the Empire having a tendency to blow up rebel bases, it's unlikely Luke would be able to keep his lightsaber powered for very long. Still, if he can get close enough to swing it, he might have a chance. But what if we took it to the next level? Number 4. Nukes. We talked about medieval weaponry, so it only makes sense we discuss modern weaponry too. Blasters are a staple of Star Wars, but are they any more dangerous than a real-life weapon? An average blaster bolt might be comparable to a bullet, but with greater range. Stormtroopers carrying E-11D blaster rifles have about 1,000 rounds per standard magazine, and the average blaster takes about 3 seconds to recharge after firing. But what about AT-ATs? These bad boys come packing with 4 laser cannons, which according to Wikipedia can penetrate up to 8 inches of armor plate. That's a lot of steel, but it's not impenetrable. How does it compare to a real-life tank? The main gun on an M1 Abrams is 105 mm and can pierce over 600 mm of steel. The AT-AT, however, has a secret weapon, although it's not designed for direct combat. The AT-AT also carries a nuclear warhead capable of destroying entire rebel bases in one fell swoop. At this point, we can safely say the Empire is at a huge advantage. Luckily, there is one thing that can level the playing field. Number 5, size. Size matters. Just ask anybody who's ever been on the wrong side of a T-Rex in the world. Of Star Wars, there's nothing more dangerous than a hungry T-Rex. Okay, that was a lie. There are plenty of things more dangerous than a T-Rex, like a T-Rex riding a Tauntaun while wearing Stormtrooper armor. Turns out that Tauntauns and Stormtrooper armor aren't much use against T-Rexes, but what they are great for is taking down AT-ATs. Tauntaun size-wise, it falls somewhere in between a horse and an elephant, and elephants are known for their ability to take down even the largest of dinosaurs. Of course, Tauntauns are nowhere near as strong as elephants, but they are fast and agile, which might just be what's needed to take down such a lumbering beast. So if Luke can't defeat the AT-AT with his lightsaber, maybe he can defeat it with a club. In all seriousness, though, there's no way a Tauntaun could take down an AT-AT, so why is this even an option? Well, because the Empire has one huge weakness. Although they have big, scary monsters on their side, they also have weak spots that are laughably easy to exploit. And we know this because it happens all the time in the movies. Just ask Han Solo, Princess Leia, Luke Skywalker, or any of the other main characters who have to destroy an AT-AT. The secret: aim for the legs. Explosives, harpoons, giant snowboards. Even a well-placed missile can bring down an AT-AT as long as you hit the legs. Now, this might be easy in the Star Wars universe, where Stormtrooper aim is so bad they can't hit an asteroid if it was standing still. But even the best soldiers in the world would have trouble bringing down an AT-AT, so the only real option left is to use animals. Elephants and Tauntauns aside, the largest land mammal in our universe is the blue whale, which weighs about 190 tons. To put that into perspective, that's about the weight of 30 fully grown Tyrannosaurus rexes. If a blue whale could somehow evolve to walk on land, it would be nearly unstoppable. And if Han Solo could convince one to help the rebellion, then it might just be the Empire's worst nightmare. Well, there you have it, folks. Outnumbered, outgunned, and with a distinct lack of blasters, the Rebel Alliance doesn't stand much of a chance against the Galactic Empire. The only question now is, what would happen if the Empire attacked first? Click here to watch one of these next videos. And let us know in the comments section which side you fight for if this battle actually happened in real life. The Middle Ages were not known for its economic mobility or innovation, but trade did continue to grow during this period in Europe. Hey there and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to discuss how medieval European economies functioned. And if you would like to learn more about the economy of medieval Europe, stay tuned because it is coming up next. Medieval European economies can be broken down into three sections: agriculture, trade, and industry. The majority of Europeans worked in agriculture. There are lots of peasants. The working hours were long with little rest and wages were low. They were so low that most people could not afford to leave the farm without their lord's permission. The serfs could only leave their lands if they had their lord's permission, and if they didn't have permission and they left anyway, they could be put in jail or worse. Serfs were also taxed heavily. They had to pay rent to the owner of the land they farmed, usually in the form of 1 day's labor a week or taxes in kind, meaning that part of what they grew had to go to the landowner. When the harvest was bad, the serfs suffered. They could not store enough grain for hard times, and when famine struck, they suffered greatly. But when the harvest was good, then the lords got rich. In order to break out of the cycle of poverty, a person needed money, and a lot of it. A person who had money and took risks by investing in new technologies or started a business was called an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs could make lots of money in medieval Europe. Medieval entrepreneurs often became very rich. They were not necessarily merchants, though many merchants became quite wealthy. A merchant is simply a person who buys and sells goods. Some merchants made large fortunes buying and selling spices, silk, and other luxury items. If you wanted to be a merchant, you probably had to start at the bottom and work your way up. You might start as an apprentice learning the skills of a particular craft. After years of training, you could become a journeyman, which meant you were qualified to do the job. With some experience under your belt, you could open your own shop and become a master. As a master, you could hire apprentices and journeymen to work for you. So while you might start out as a lowly street vendor, you could build up your business and eventually run a major trading company. The key to being successful in business was having a good product that lots of people wanted. For example, those luxury items from Asia like silk and spices were very profitable. The demand for these items was high in medieval Europe, but the supply was low, so the prices were high. This high demand and low supply meant great profit for the merchants who could get them. Not everyone had access to those exotic goods, though. In order to get to Europe, they had to travel through the Middle East, which was controlled by Muslims at the time. So European Christians were wary of doing business in Muslim lands. That's why European merchants sent Jewish or Muslim middlemen to do their bidding. These middlemen paid the merchants in gold and silver, then used that money to buy the desired goods and sold them for a profit. But these luxury items were only accessible to the wealthy elite. The poor bought what was locally produced: wine from France, wool from England, timber from Germany, flax from Belgium, and glass from Venice. One way to keep track of all this trade was through accounting. Accounting involves keeping detailed records of the financial transactions of a business. It helped merchants keep track of their money and assets. It also kept track of how much money the king received in taxes. Think of a spreadsheet, but done with quill pens and paper. Double-entry bookkeeping was the method used in medieval Europe. In this method, every transaction was recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit. This helped ensure that the records were accurate and complete. One of the best-known medieval accountants was the Italian monk Luca Pacioli. He wrote a book called Summary of Arithmetic, Geometry, Proportions, and Proportionality. It was published in 1494 and is considered the first accounting textbook. While it wasn't specifically written for merchants, it laid the foundation for double-entry bookkeeping. Trade guilds played an important role in medieval European economies. A trade guild was an association of merchants or artisans who dealt in a particular good. Its purpose was to protect the interests of the merchants and artisans. They set standards for quality and established rules for the trade. They also provided a support system for members. Most cities had several different trade guilds. To become a member of a guild, you had to serve an apprenticeship. This usually lasted 7 years, and you had to be a master of your trade to join. membership in a guild, was expensive and required payment of fees. Being a member of a guild offered many benefits, though. Members were guaranteed a certain standard of living and they were protected from competition. They also had access to a pool of common labor. If a member needed extra help, he could call on the other members of his guild to assist him. And if a guild member died, the other members would care for his family. Trade guilds sometimes got a bit too powerful, though, and abused their power. They lobbied the government to protect their interests and sometimes resorted to violence. They were also resistant to change, since it was hard to get into a guild and merchants and artisans were reluctant to give up the security of a guild. This led to stagnation in many industries. The most famous medieval trade guild was the Hanseatic League. It was a group of Northern European merchants that dominated trade in the Baltic Sea from the 13th to 17th centuries. At its peak, the League had over 100 members. Now let's take a look at markets. There were two kinds of markets in medieval Europe: open-air marketplaces and indoor shops. Open-air marketplaces were common in rural areas and were used for buying and selling agricultural products. They were also used for trading manufactured goods. Indoor shops were common in urban areas and were used for retail sales. They were also used for personal services such as barbering and shoe repairing. Markets were important social institutions in medieval Europe. They were places where people could come together and trade goods and services. They were also a source of news and gossip. The market was the place to be if you wanted to know what was going on in the world. People from all walks of life came to the market. Peasants came to sell their produce and buy manufactured goods. Merchants came to buy and sell a wide variety of goods, and nobles came to buy luxury items and socialize. Markets were also important to the economy. They provided a place where buyers and sellers could come together and exchange goods and services. This helped to stimulate economic activity and promote trade. Finally, let's talk about a medievalized trade internet, the Silk Road. The Silk Road was a network of trade routes that connected Europe with Asia. It was named for the silk that was traded along the routes. However, silk was not the only good that was traded. Other goods included spices, tea, porcelain, and precious metals. The Silk Road was important because it connected different cultures and facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas. It also helped to stimulate economic activity and promote trade. The Silk Road was also dangerous. Travelers faced the threat of bandits, wild animals, and harsh weather conditions. Despite the dangers, many people traveled the Silk Road because the rewards were great. Those who successfully navigated the route could make great profits by trading the valuable goods of Asia for the gold and silver of Europe. The Silk Road was a very important part of the medieval economy. It helped to connect Europe with Asia and facilitate the exchange of goods and ideas. It also helped to stimulate economic activity and promote trade. So now you know a little something about medieval economics. What do you think? Leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. It really helps us out. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Hi everyone. In this episode of What If, we are going to ask what would happen if the role of religion in society never changed after the Middle Ages. To answer this question, we are going to use our knowledge of history to examine what role religion played in medieval life and then apply that to modern times. So let's get started. In order to understand what would happen if the role of religion never changed after the Middle Ages, it's important to know what role it did play. In medieval Europe, the Christian Church was the largest landowner, the most powerful institution and the single biggest patron of the arts and sciences. Monasteries functioned as schools, libraries, and hospitals, and friars traveled the countryside teaching peasants about Christianity and performing miracles. Most books were handwritten by monks in monasteries who also served as teachers, and some of them even translated ancient texts from Greek and Arabic into Latin, thereby preserving them for future generations. It was also the scholars in the Catholic Church that made significant advances in astronomy and mathematics. Now that we have a good idea of the role that religion played in medieval life, let's see how things would be different today if it hadn't changed. One of the most noticeable aspects of the medieval world was the omnipresence of churches. Practically every town had a church and services were mandatory. Today, if we went back to that system. Every town would have to build a church, and people would be forced to go to Mass at least once a week. In fact, probably more than once a week, because during the Middle Ages, people would often go to Mass multiple times per day. Now, I can already hear some people saying, "But Mark, there are still churches in every town and people still go to Mass." Well, yes, that's true, but not everyone goes and not everyone has to go. Back in the Middle Ages, going to church was considered a civic duty. The king demanded it and the Pope enforced it. Churches weren't the only religious buildings that would be omnipresent, however. Monasteries, too, would be found in practically every town or village, although their role would have to change a bit. You see, back in the Middle Ages, monks were typically poor men who gave up all of their worldly possessions to live a life of prayer and service to God. However, nowadays there aren't many poor people who have nothing else to do. Therefore, monasteries would have to offer some kind of incentive in order